So, starting off with the muscles, the first set of muscles are the thoracic muscles. So the first muscle we're going to talk about is the trapezius muscle, and it's the triangular shaped muscle that runs dorsally to the spine of the scapula. Its origin is the ligamentum nuchae and ligaments of the dorsal midline, and its insertion is the scapular spine. And its function is to raise the scapula, advance the forelimb, and swing the forelimb caudally. So the next muscle is the rhomboideus muscle, which is right underneath the trapezius muscle. Its origin is also the ligamentum nuchae and ligaments of the dorsal midline, and it's inserted in the medial side of the scapular cartilage, and its function is to raise and rotate the scapula. And then the supraspinatus is the muscle right in front of the scapular cartilage, originating in the supraspinous fossa of the scapula, inserting the greater tubercle of the humerus, and its function is stabilizing and extending the shoulder. So these next set, the first one is the infraspinatus muscle, which is right behind the scapular cartilage. Its origin is the infraspinatus fossa of the scapula, insertion greater tubercle of the humerus, and its function is to stabilize and flex the shoulder. And so the latissimus dorsi muscle, it's originated in the spinous processes of the thoracic and lumbar vertebrae, inserted in the medial humerus, and its function is limb retraction and shoulder flexion. And then the serratus ventralis is the next muscle. It's originated in the transverse processes of the caudal, cervical, and craniothoracic vertebrae. It's inserted in the medial scapula and the scapular cartilage, and its main function is to lift the neck and advance and retract the scapula. And so the biceps brachii muscles, they're located on the cranial side of the limb, and they're anterior to the humerus. It also has two heads, and its origin is the supraglenoid tubercle of the scapula. Its insertion is the cranial aspect of proximal radius and ulna, and its main function is to extend the shoulder and flex the elbow. And so the triceps brachii is on the caudal side of the limb and has three heads. Its origin is the caudal border of the scapula. Its insertion is the olecranon process of the ulna, and its main function is to extend the elbow. And so moving on to the subscapularis muscle, this one is located right beneath the scapula. Its origin is the subscapular fossa. Its insertion is the medial humerus, and it acts as a medial collateral ligament. So the last two muscles of the thoracic muscles are the pectoralis superficialis and the pectoralis profundus. So these muscles are the division of the pectoral muscle, and the pectoralis superficialis is originated in the sternum and cranial-costal cartilages. It's inserted in the medial humerus and the fascia of the arm and the forearm, and then its function is adduction of the forelimb. And so the pectoralis profundus muscle is originated in the sternum, the ribs, and abdominal fascia, and it's inserted in the craniomedial humerus, and then its function is the adduction and retraction of the forelimb. So the next set of muscles are the abdominal muscles, and we're going to start off with the rectus abdominis muscle. So this forms the muscular floor of the abdomen. Its origin is the costal cartilage and sternum, insertion pubis via the prepubic tendon, and its function is to move the body between the ribcage and the pelvis. And so the transversus abdominis is the deepest of the abdominal muscles, originated in the deep thoracolumbar fascia, the caudal ribs, and the lumbar vertebrae, and it's inserted in the linea alba. And its function is to compress the abdominal viscera. And so the next muscles are the obliquus externus abdominis and the obliquus internus abdominis. So the externus abdominis is the most superficial abdominal muscle. It overlaps the internal oblique abdominis, and the fibers run obliquely ventral and caudal. Its origin is the last few ribs and thoracolumbar fascia. Insertion is the linea alba, the brim of the pelvis, and the tuber coxae. And the function is to compress the abdominal viscera. And so the obliquus internus abdominis, the muscle fibers run obliquely ventral and cranial, and it's originated in the tuber coxae and the transverse processes of the lumbar vertebrae. It's inserted in the linea alba, the caudal ribs, and the brim of the pelvis, and its function is to compress the abdominal viscera. So the next set of muscles are the pelvic muscles. So we got the gluteus medius. These are originated in the wing of the ilium, tuber coxae, the sacrum, and the sacrosciatic ligament. Its insertion is the greater trochanter of the femur, and its main function is to extend the hip. The bicep femoris muscle are one of the hamstring muscles, and they are the most lateral of the caudal muscles of the thigh. Its origin is the sacrum, sacrosciatic ligament, and the ischial tuber. The insertion is the patellar ligament, patella, and the calcaneal tuber, and its function is to extend the hip, the stifle, and hock, and to flex the stifle. So the semimembranosus muscle is another muscle of the hamstring, and it's the most medial of these muscles. Its origin is the caudal vertebrae, sacroiliac ligament, and ischial tuber. Insertion, medial distal femur, medial proximal tibia, and the fascia lata. And its function is to extend the hip and stifle, and then to flex the stifle. And so the semitendinosus muscle is another part of the hamstring muscles, and it's the middle muscle of the caudal group. Its origin is the sacrum, the caudal vertebrae, sacroiliac ligament, and ischial tuber. Its insertion is the cranial tibia and the calcaneal tuber, and its function is the extension of the hip, the stifle and the hock, and the flexion of the stifle. And so then we have the tensor fascia lata, and this muscle is the flexor of the hip. Its origin is the tubercocce, insertion, fascia lata, and as mentioned before, function is function of the hip, but also the extension of the stifle. So the last two muscles of this group are the quadriceps femoris and the gastrocnemius. The quadriceps femoris muscle is the primary extensor of the stifle and also flexes the hip. It's originated in the proximal femur and the body of the ilium, and its insertion is the patella. And so then the gastrocnemius muscle makes up the bulk of the calcanean tendon. It's originated in the caudal aspect of the femoral condyles, inserted in the tuber calcanei, and its function is hock extension.
The food will enter the oral cavity of the cow. In the oral cavity, you will find the tongue, which has papillae. Cows have filiform, fungiform, folate, and conical papillae. These are bumps on the tongue that help grip food, and some are taste buds. The next part the food would move to is the esophagus. The esophagus of a cow is made of skeletal muscle, and it is a stratified squamous epithelium. The esophagus uses peristalsis to move food down. Next, the food would move to the rumen. The rumen is rough and used for microbial digestion. From the rumen, the food would move to the reticulum. The reticulum is a honeycomb shape. The reticulum's purpose is to make a bolus and a cud. Next, the food would move to the omasum. The omasum has small bumps within the stomach, and it's used for water absorption. Lastly, the food would move into the abomasum, or the true stomach, where chemical digestion occurs, and it's mainly folded. In calves, they use the succulus rumeno-reticularis. This is a groove in which milk bypasses the rumen because it does not need to be fermented, and it goes straight into the abomasum. Both suckling and copper sulfate trigger this groove to close. Then it would enter the pylorus. Then the food would enter the duodenum, or the first part of the small intestine. This releases cholecystokinin, gastric inhibitory peptide, and secretin, and helps inhibit parietal cells. Then it passes the duodenum and the ileum. In the small intestine, secretions of the pancreas and gallbladder help aid digestion. The small intestine has tight junctions, so the absorption goes through the cell. The surface area of the small intestine is increased by villi. The liver is the largest gland, and it secretes bile. The bile is stored in the gallbladder. Cholecystokinin is what stimulates the gallbladder to release the bile. Bile helps break down lipids into smaller-sized particles called micelle. This makes it easier to digest. The liver, which releases the bile, has a portal triad, which consists of the hepatic artery, the portal vein, the central vein, and a bile duct. The pancreas is also important for digestion. The pancreatic islets release insulin and glucagon, which both control blood sugar. The pancreas also molds to the shape of the stomach. Lastly, the food moves into the large intestine, which consists of the cecum, colon, and rectum. This food is now mainly waste products and is excreted out. The perineum is the membrane surrounding the abdominal organs. The pylorus helps prevent the intestinal contents from re-entering the stomach and is a muscular sphincter. The sphincter of Oddi controls the release of bile and pancreatic juices from the liver and the pancreas. The ampulla of Vater is where bile ducts and pancreatic ducts meet. The common bile duct carries bile from the liver and gallbladder to the small intestines, and the main pancreatic duct brings bile from the liver to the gallbladder. The urinary system starts off with the kidneys. Cows have multilobar kidneys. The kidneys consist of the medulla and the cortex, the renal pyramid, which is a triangular cross-section of the kidney, and has tubules that carry fluids to the kidney. It also has calyx, which is the space within the renal hilus that collects urine from the pyramid. The nephron is a functional unit of the kidney. It absorbs nutrients and waste products are expelled as urine. The medulla is the deeper portion of the kidney, and the cortex is a superficial portion of the kidney. The kidney uses ureters, which bring the urine to the bladder. And when the bladder is full, the urine goes through the urethra and is expelled out.
All right, so for the nervous system, we're going to break it up into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is composed of the cerebrum, which you can see right here, and it is responsible for primitive thinking, and it has sulci and gyri, which you can see in these pictures, and these increase surface area. And then there's the cerebellum, which is in charge of higher thinking. And then you can see the brainstem here, and the pituitary gland is here, and it has a nervous component to it, and it produces hormones. And the meninges are the three membranes that surround the brain. The innermost is the pia mater, which you can see in this picture. And then the middle one is the arachnoid, and it has webbing and it contains the cerebrospinal fluid, and the outermost one is the dura mater. And then the tentorium cerebelli is what separates where the cerebellum and the cerebrum are held. And then for the peripheral nervous system, it's composed of the brachial plexus, which is the aggregation of nerves from the spinal cord to the forelimb, and it includes the subscapular nerve, the suprascapular nerve, the pectoral nerve, the musculocutaneous nerve, and the radial nerve. And you can see those in the picture to the left. And then the peripheral nervous system is also composed of the lumbosacral plexus, which are nerves emerging from the lumbar region. And this includes the femoral nerve, the gluteus medius nerves, the sciatic nerve, the arbitrary nerve, which innervates the adductor and the gracilis muscles, and the tibial nerve. Okay, so in this section, we're going to talk about the muscles of the head. Here's a summary of the muscles we're going to talk about. And here's an image of the head we dissected in lab. And you can see some of the muscles, but some of the muscles were also accidentally cut through. So for the orbicularis oculi muscle, it originates at the nasal part of the frontal bone and the frontal process of maxilla and the lacrimal bone, and inserts at the skin of the orbital region, and its function is to close the eyelid. Then there's the masseter, which originates at the zygomatic arc and inserts at the lateral mandible, and it is a very powerful muscle of the jaw, and it's responsible for mastication. And then there's the temporal muscle, which originates at the temporal fossa and inserts at the coronoid process of the mandible, and its function is to close the jaw. Then there's the digastricus muscle, and it originates caudal to the temporomandibular joint and inserts medial to the mandible, and its function is to push the jaw open. And then there's the genioglossus, which originates at the rostral mandible and inserts at the base of the tongue, and its function is to extend the tongue. The hyoglossus originates at the hyoid apparatus and inserts at the base of the tongue, and its function is to retract the tongue. And then there's the orbicularis oris, which originates near the medial maxilla and mandible, and inserts at the skin and mucous membrane of the lips, and its function is to close the mouth and the lips. Then there's the levator labii superioris, which originates between the nares and inserts at the upper lip, and its function is to pull the lip up. An example of this muscle in action is during the Flehmen response in horses due to pheromone stimulation. And then there's also the levator nasopalaealis muscle, which originates at the frontal bone and it inserts at the nose and the angle of the lip, and it pulls the nares and the edges of the lips. And then there's the pterygoideus, which originates at the pterygoid bone, which is a hook-like structure, and it inserts at the medial mandible, and it's responsible for closing the jaw and moving the jaw laterally. And then there's the caninus, which originates at the maxilla, and inserts at the lateral aspect of the nares. And its function is to pull the nose laterally and flare the nostrils. And then there's the buccinator muscle, which originates at the maxilla, and it inserts, it basically blends with the muscles of the upper lip, and its function is to help with mastication and swallowing. And then there's the zygomaticus, which originates at the epimysium of the masseter muscle and the angle of the mouth, and then inserts at the angle of the lips. And its function is to pull the lips laterally.
Circulatory system overview. The circulatory system goes through two pathways, pulmonary circulation and systemic circulation. Pulmonary circulation sends deoxygenated blood to the lungs to trade CO2 for oxygen. Systemic circulation sends oxygenated blood throughout the body. Adult circulation goes as follows. Deoxygenated blood from the body comes in from the vena cava, a vein that contains cranial caudal ends, where it travels to the heart inside the right atrium, which pumps to the right ventricle. Separating the right atrium and ventricle is the tricuspid valve. Valves prevent blood from flowing in from the wrong direction. From the right atrium, it passes the pulmonary valve, going to the pulmonary artery/trunk, leading the blood into the lungs where it becomes oxygenated. After being oxygenated, the blood goes into the pulmonary vein that enters the left atrium. The left atrium pumps the blood into the left ventricle, and the bicuspid valve separates the two. Before entering the aorta, the primary artery, and distributing blood across the body, the blood will pass through the aortic valve. Physical structures of the heart include the pericardium, a fibrous sac that protects the heart, chorda tendineae, which attaches to the papillary muscles, hold the AV valve in place to prevent inversion into the atrium. Apex is the base of the heart. Coronary arteries supply blood to the heart, and mesenteric arteries supply blood into the intestines. In fetal circulation, the umbilical arteries carry deoxygenated blood from the mother to the fetus. The umbilical vein pumps the oxygenated blood from the right ventricle into the pulmonary artery, which flows into the placenta and into the mother's circulatory system. Ductus arterioso removes blood from the pulmonary artery to the aorta and later turns into the ligamentum arteriosum after birth, attaching the aorta to the pulmonary artery. Ductus venosus allows the oxygenated blood from the mother to be sent across the placenta to the fetus, bypassing the liver as well. Finally, the foramen ovule allows the blood entering from the right atrium to skip into the left atrium.
Now, as we come to the female reproductive system, specifically focusing on the external genitalia, it is known as the vulva. It is made up of the left and right labias, which conceals the entryway to the vagina. Now, the vagina shares a common space with the urinary bladder and the urethra, which is known as the vestibule. As we make our way up the vagina, we come to this denser structure known as the cervix, which essentially provides a barrier to the uterus. The uterus is the primary site of fetal development and attachment, and it is made up of the uterine body and the uterine horns. The ratio of these structures in their size depends largely on the species. Specifically in cows, the horns tend to be a bit larger. And in cows, the uterus type is known as bicornuate. As we move through the horns, we come to the oviduct, which is the primary site of fertilization of the egg following ovulation. And the egg is produced within the primary site of gamete production in females, the ovaries. So follicles will develop here and eventually result in ovulation. Given that we did not have a male calf during the dissection process, we are going to look at this diagram to represent the male reproductive anatomy for bovines. So focusing in on the scrotum, that is the external bilobular structure that stores the testes and the epididymis, the testes being the primary site of gamete production and maturation, which as they mature are then stored in the epididymis and concentrated prior to ejaculation. So once the sperm reach maturity, they will be held in the epididymis, and during the ejaculation process, they will travel through the ductus deferens, otherwise known as the vas deferens, to eventually travel through the urethra and out through the penile shaft, which specifically in bovines, the penis is a fibroelastic penis, meaning that it maintains a sigmoid flexure thanks to the retractor penis muscles, otherwise allowing it to sort of slip out when those muscles relax. So focusing back in on the process of ejaculation, the ductus deferens is otherwise also part of what is known as the spermatic cord, which is also made up of various muscles and the pampiniform plexus, which allows for the temperature regulation of the testes, given that the testes have to be held at a temperature about 6 degrees Celsius less than the internal body temperature to ensure successful gamete maturation or production.
Next, we'll be getting into the respiratory system. So first, we're going to be going over the tongue. There's three major muscles of the tongue, which is the myohydius, genioglossus, and hyoglossus. The myohydius moves the jaw forward and backward, and its insertion is on the hyoid bone, and the origin is on the mandible. The genioglossus opens and closes the mouth. Its insertion is on the hyoid bone, and origin is on the superior mental spines, and it's the most superior of the three muscles. And lastly, the hyoglossus opens and closes the jaw. Its insertion is along the side of the tongue, and the origin is along the whole hyoid bone. And it is the most caudal of the three muscles. Next, we have different types of papillae, which is the filiform, which is found towards the apex of the tongue, the conical found in ruminants, which is found between the body and root of the tongue, the fungiform, which is found between the body and apex of the tongue, and then valley, which is also found between the body and root of the tongue. The last type of papillae is foliate, which is only found in monogastrics, so therefore it's not found in cows. Next, we're going to be going over the pharynx, which is the top part of the throat that connects to the nasal cavities and lets air bypass through the lungs. The nasal cavity contains a dorsal and ventral concha that divide the breathing space along with the middle common and ventral meatus. The functions are to allow inhaled air to better interact with the different parts of the respiratory cavity and helps monitor air and temperature when the air passes through. It also aids in olfaction, respiratory, and aids in immunity. Then we have the epiglottis, which is a flap located behind the tongue and at the top of the larynx, which lies caudal to the base of the tongue. During swallowing, the tongue and the larynx work together to fold the epiglottis so that it covers the entrance of the larynx and direct food towards the digestive tract and air towards the respiratory tract. Lastly, there's the glottis, which is the part of the larynx that opening containing the vocal cords and the space between them. We also have the Eschine tube opening, which connects the middle ear and the nasal sinus cavity, as well as the esophagus, which is a hollow muscular tube that carries food and liquid from the stomach from the throat to the stomach muscles and found at the top and bottom to aid in digestion. Next, we have the larynx, which contains the hyoid apparatus, which suspends the tongue and larynx, holds the larynx in place, and also supports the tongue and pharynx from the skull. And it's attached by the synchrondosis joint to the temporal bone of the skull. The vestibule is a laryngeal space and is separated from the infloglottic cavity by by the vocal cord and central coval process. There's thyroid cartilage that consists of two parallel plates called laminae on each side and joined by ventral midline. The laminae of the thyroid cartilage have processes that functions with other cartilages and attaches to other muscles associated with the larynx. We also have the thyroid gland associated in this process and attached to the thyroid. We also have arachnoid cartilage, which are found in pairs and are irregularly shaped, causing the processes to differ between animals. The movement of this cartilage changes the tension and angles of the vocal ligaments, which causes change in pitch. And lastly, the cercoid cartilage, shaped like a signet ring, and articulates with the thyroid cartilage and two arytenoid cartilage that also attach to the cartilage ring of the trachea. Next, the trachea extends from the caudal end of the larynx to the bronchi. It forms tracheal rings and is lined with cilia to prevent foreign particles toward the larynx. Its function is to funnel air, inhale air towards the lungs, and exhale the air out from the body. It's composed to the tracheal rings, the tracheal muscle, and mucosa. These tracheal rings are cartilaginous rings made of hyaline cartilage around the trachea that look like cartilaginous incomplete circles and are connected by the angular ligament. This angular ligament is located between the space of the neighboring tracheal rings, and the trachealis muscle is located between the gap of the cartilaginous rings. And a sympathetic response of this, when the trachealis would relax and dilate and allow for increased airflow. Meanwhile, a parasympathetic response, it would contract, pulling the tracheal ring closer and restricting more airflow. We also have the principal bronchi, which is made of smooth muscle and cartilage, and it's the trachea divides into two principal bronchi, each connecting to each lung. And where they divide is called the carina, and this is where they bifurcate. The principal bronchi continues to divide, forming secondary bronchus, which have support, tertiary bronchus, which have no support, respiratory bronchial, alveolar ducts, and finally the alveoli. Once the principal bronchi is divided into secondary bronchi, it's only found inside the lung sacs, and the branches get smaller with each bifurcate. The functional unit of the principal bronchi is the alveoli, which is clusters of air sacs where gas exchange occurs, and between the alveoli there are type 1 and type 2 pneumonocytes. Type 1 pneumonocytes give structure, where type 2 produces surfactants, secretory gland structure, and secretion. Next, we have the vena cava foramen, which is a major structure that passes through the diaphragm, where the vena cava passes through this caval opening into the diaphragm. The esophageal hiatus is the major structure that passes through the diaphragm and the opening in the diaphragm, where the esophagus passes from the thoracic to the abdominal cavity. And then we have the aortic hiatus, which is a major structure that passes through the diaphragm, and the opening allows for passage of the aorta and its vessels into the retroperitoneal space. The diaphragm seals the abdominal cavity and thoracic region and keeps the thoracic cavity under negative pressure and positive pressure in the abdominal cavity. It's a dome-shaped muscle seat, and contraction flattens it, lowering the pressure in the thoracic cavity and drawing air into the lungs. Lastly, with the lungs, where the right side has 4 lobes and the left side has 4 lobes, there's a surfactant made in the lung, which is made of a mixture of fat and protein in the lungs, contains its secretory granules. They increase surface tension, reduce the work required by the lung to expand with each breath. They promote the stability of the alveoli, and different species of lipids line the inner space of the alveoli, which help keep the alveoli dry and prevents transduction of fluid. Synthetic surfactants can be infused through the trachea and induce expansion of the lungs. And lastly, the pleura is the membrane lining of the thoracic cavity. The visceral pleura is closest to the lung, while the parietal pleura is closest to the thoracic cage, which creates an intrapleural space between the parietal layers, which is a serous fluid-filled space. And lastly, we have our citation.
Overview of the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a collection of glands and hormones that regulate numerous physiological responses throughout the body. The pituitary gland is located in the brain, right below the hypothalamus, a gland that it works closely with. Often known as the master gland, it contains 2 lobes, anterior and posterior. The anterior lobe is glandular, contains a portal system, and makes LH, FSH, prolactin, ACTH, TSH, and GH. The posterior lobe doesn't produce its own hormones nor has a portal system. Oxytocin and ADH enter the posterior lobe from the axons of the PBN and SON in the hypothalamus. The thalamus is located in the neck region and shows T cells, different types of antigens to increase diversity. These cells become specialized, mature, leave the thalamus, and go into the bloodstream. The pancreas is located above the duodenum, and it contains both exocrine and endocrine functions. The pancreas contains islets of Langerhans, which create glucagon and insulin hormones. These hormones help control your blood sugar. The testes, which are also part of the reproduction system, are located only on males inside the scrotum. It secretes the hormones testosterone and inhibin. It also produces sperm, the male gamete. The ovaries, the female counterpart of the testes, are located on the left and right side of the uterus. It secretes the hormones estrogen and progesterone. It also produces oocyte/eggs, the female gamete. The adrenal gland is located on top of the kidneys. The adrenal gland has 2 layers, just like the kidney, the cortex and medulla, which produce different hormones. The main hormones it produces are cortisol and aldosterone. These hormones help regulate metabolism and blood pressure.
The stifle joint is located in the hind limbs of quadrupeds such as the cow and is essentially the equivalent of the human knee. The stifle joint joins the femur to the tibia alongside the patella, which is a sesamoid bone that provides an articular surface known as the trochlea that aids in the movement of this joint. The spleen is a large organ within the lymphatic system that is the primary reservoir for red blood cells. It is also responsible for the destruction and removal of old red blood cells as they are lysed as they move through small capillaries in the spleen. Spleen is also important for the regulation of other immune system cells such as white blood cells and platelets.